The lawyer set the folder on my table like it was nothing. Yellow cover, black lettering, my name printed across the front in a font so clean it almost looked official. It almost looked real. It was my psychiatric record. I had never seen it before in my life. I sat there in my dress uniform, 17 years of Air Force service, pinned and pressed across my chest, and I read my own mental health history for the first time. The document said I was emotionally dissociative, prone to detachment under stress, unable to form stable attachments with children in my care, unfit to serve as a guardian. The words were clinical and precise and completely, entirely fabricated, assembled from the raw material of someone else's pain and stamped with my name like a receipt. The document was signed by a real doctor. The patient it described was not me. I looked up slowly from the folder, the way you learn to move when the ground underneath you might be mined, when every instinct is screaming that something is wrong but panic will only make it worse. Across the aisle, at the opposing counsel's table, my brother Daniel sat with his hands folded neatly in front of him, very still, the particular stillness of a man who has decided the outcome of a situation long before it began. His wife Yvette sat beside him, wearing a pale blue dress I recognized as new. She had a way of marking her victories in advance with small purchases. I noticed she had also gotten her nails done, and in the fourth row of the gallery, a man I had never seen before was watching me. Not the way spectators watch, with idle curiosity or mild interest. He was watching me the way a person watches when they've been waiting for something specific to happen. When our eyes met, he gave a single, slow nod, just barely perceptible, and then he looked away. I did not know who he was. I did not know why he was there, but I understood, in the way that 17 years of reading situations for a living teaches you to understand things, that his presence meant something I had not accounted for. Judge Harold Weston took his seat at the bench. He was a man in his late 50s with the kind of face that had probably looked authoritative even at 20, and he wore his authority the way some men wear expensive watches, constantly aware of it, always angling it toward the light. He shuffled the papers in front of him, and I noticed his eyes did not go to the folder that had just been placed on my table. They had no reason to. He had already read it. His gaze moved to me with the particular, measuring quality of a man who has formed an opinion and is looking for confirmation of it. His eyes moved from my face to my uniform, briefly, and something in the set of his mouth shifted just slightly, the way it does when someone has decided to manage you rather than hear you. "Lieutenant Colonel Caldwell," he said, and his voice was the kind of voice that fills courtrooms the way furniture fills rooms, occupying space as a matter of principle. "I understand you've had an opportunity to review the documentation submitted by opposing counsel." I said that I had. "And do you have anything you'd like to say before we proceed?" Behind me, I could feel Marcus. I did not have to turn around to know he was sitting in the third row with his grandmother on one side and my attorney's paralegal on the other, holding the stuffed bear his mother had bought him at the gift shop of Naval Air Station Oceana on a Tuesday afternoon 2 years before she died. He was 7 years old and he still slept with that bear, which his mother had named Captain for reasons she never fully explained, and which Marcus had rechristened Cap, and which he carried everywhere with the matter-of-fact unself-consciousness of a child who has not yet learned that the world expects you to put down the things that comfort you. I thought about Grace buying that bear. I thought about the sealed envelope she had pressed into my hand 6 months before her last flight, standing in the parking lot of a Waffle House off Interstate 64, because we had stopped for coffee on the way back from her son's soccer game, and she had handed it to me out of nowhere, tucking it into my jacket pocket and saying, "You'll know when. You always know when." I had opened it at 2 in the morning, alone at my kitchen table, after Marcus finally fell asleep and the house was quiet enough that I could hear the clock in the hallway and my own careful breathing. I had not slept since. "Your Honor," I said, and my voice came out the way I trained it, to come out in every briefing room and command tent and debrief that had ever tested it, flat and clear and carrying, a voice that did not ask for anything but made plain that it expected to be heard. "I have quite a bit to say." I set my own folder on the table. It was thicker than theirs. The folder had taken me 11 days to build. I want to be honest about that, because I think the timeline matters. I did not walk into that courtroom with a secret weapon I had been keeping warm for years. I walked in with 11 days of work, which is what you do when someone tries to take your child in a jurisdiction where a piece of paper with the right signature carries more weight than 17 years of your life. You work with what you have. You work in the time you have, and you make sure that when you finally open the briefcase, What comes out of it is enough. The lawsuit had been filed 42 days earlier. I had been served on a Wednesday morning, standing in my kitchen in running clothes, still sweaty from my 5-mile loop around the neighborhood, and the process server had handed me the papers with the slightly apologetic look that people develop when they serve documents to someone in athletic wear, because it makes the contrast too stark. The ordinary morning life crashing into the extraordinary legal intervention. I stood on my front porch and read through the filing once, and then I went inside and called my attorney. Her name was Priya Anand. She was 29 years old, 4 years out of law school, and she came recommended by a fellow Air Force veteran who had told me, "She is the least impressed person I have ever met, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment." Priya was small and quick, and had a habit of tapping her pen against her legal pad in sets of 3 when she was thinking, and she had looked at the initial filing with an expression of focused, professional disdain that I found more reassuring than any amount of false reassurance would have been. "They're claiming PTSD-related instability," she had said, tapping twice and then a third time. "They have a psychological evaluation signed by someone named Alan Merritt. Do you know a Dr. Alan Merritt?" I did not. "Have you ever been evaluated for PTSD?" I had not. I had been screened, the way all returning service members are screened. And I had been cleared, the way the ones who are cleared, and I had made my peace with the particular costs of 2 deployments in my own way, in my own time, without documentation. That was not a secret, and it was not a failure. It was a private accounting, the kind that soldiers keep in the margins of their lives, and it had left me functional and present and capable, which anyone who had worked with me in the last decade could confirm. "So there is no legitimate basis for this evaluation," Priya had said. It was not a question. "None," I said. She had tapped her pen 3 more times and said, "Good. Then let's find out whose evaluation it actually is." The morning of the first hearing, I arrived 40 minutes early and sat in my car in the parking garage and thought about Grace. This was a habit I had developed in the 3 years since her death, this deliberate sitting and thinking about her in the specific, sensory way that keeps people real after they are gone. I thought about the sound of her laugh, which was too loud for indoors and always had been. I thought about the way she could eat an entire pizza by herself and feel no guilt whatsoever. I thought about her flying, the particular expression of absolute concentration that her face took on in the cockpit, a focus so complete it looked almost like peace. She had been a better pilot than I was. I had been flying longer, but Grace had the instinct, the physical fluency with a machine that some people are simply born with and cannot be taught. She had died in what was officially classified as a training accident, which I had accepted because I had no reason not to, and because grief in the immediate aftermath does not leave much room for suspicion. I was starting to have reasons now. Marcus had been 4 when his mother died. He had been living with me for 3 years, long enough that he called my house home without having to think about it, long enough that he had a drawer full of soccer socks in the hallway closet, and a collection of library books on the bedside table, and a favorite mug shaped like a frog that he used exclusively for hot chocolate. He was a serious child, not unhappy, but thoughtful in the way of children who have learned early that some things cannot be undone, and who have decided to move forward anyway because that is the only direction available. His father, my brother Daniel, had not been present for most of those 3 years. This was not an accident, and it was not a tragedy. Daniel had made his choices, the way people make choices when the alternative is being accountable, and his choices had consistently pointed away from the responsibilities of fatherhood and toward the various arrangements and agreements that Yvette found more conducive to the life she had planned. They had not contested Grace's will. They had signed off on the guardianship quietly and with apparent relief and gone about their lives. Until the will was audited 18 months later and someone, presumably Yvette, discovered what Grace had actually left. I did not know the full amount. Grace had never told me. And I had not asked, because asking felt like a betrayal of the implicit understanding between us, which was that Marcus came first, and the money was a practical matter to be handled by practical people in due time. What I knew was that Grace had been careful, and that careful people with good salaries and life insurance policies and investment accounts that compound over decades tend to leave behind more than people expect. Enough, apparently, for Yvette to buy a new dress and have her nails done and sit in a family court hearing with the settled expression of a woman who has already decided this is hers. My lawyer was already at our table when I came through the courtroom doors. Priya looked up from her notes, assessed my uniform, my posture, and whatever she saw in my face, and gave me a single nod that meant we're ready. I sat down. I straightened my jacket. I placed my folder on the table and did not open it. Opposing counsel was a man named Ferris, mid-40s. The kind of practiced smoothness that comes from years of winning cases he probably should not have won. He shook Priya's hand with genuine warmth and mine with careful neutrality, which told me he had done his research and knew better than to be dismissive. Some lawyers make the mistake of underestimating women in uniform. Ferris was not that kind of lawyer, which meant he was the more dangerous kind. The gallery was full for a family court hearing, which was unusual. Court watchers, mostly the retired men and women who treat courtrooms like theater and know the procedural rhythms well enough to anticipate the interesting moments. A few law students with notebooks. Someone from the local paper who I recognized by the press credential around his neck. And the man from the parking lot who had apparently arrived before me and claimed his seat in the fourth row as if he had reserved it. Judge Weston opened the session, and Ferris made his opening statement, which was a clean and professionally calibrated performance, centering on Marcus's welfare and the genuine concern of a father who had done some growing up and was now prepared to be present in his son's life. Ferris did not attack me directly in the opening. He did not need to. The psychological evaluation sitting in a folder at the court clerk's desk did the attacking for him. Then, Dr. Alan Merritt took the stand. He was a slight man with a gray beard, and the slightly defensive bearing of someone who knows his credentials are going to be challenged, and has decided the best defense is to lead with them extensively. He was a licensed clinical psychologist, board certified, with 22 years of experience, including 9 years contracted with the Department of Defense evaluating service members for psychological fitness. He spoke in the careful, measured cadence of someone who testifies regularly, spacing his sentences to give them time to land. I listened to every word. I did not react to any of them, not because I felt nothing, but because reaction was what Ferris was hoping for. Every evaluation room and debrief and command tent had taught me the same thing. The person who controls their face controls the room. So I sat still, and I listened, and I kept my face in the expression I'd learned in a windowless briefing room at Langley Air Force Base 12 years ago. The expression that means nothing, because it is not trying to mean anything. The expression that tells the room exactly as much as I want it to tell the room, which in this moment was nothing at all. Merritt described me as someone who had exhibited patterns consistent with complex post-traumatic stress response. He described emotional detachment, difficulty maintaining consistent caregiving presence, episodes of dissociation during high-stress periods. He was careful and specific and clinical, and every word he said was a precise construction built on a foundation that Priya and I had spent 11 days locating and documenting. The foundation was someone else's life. During the lunch recess, I was standing on the courthouse steps trying to decide whether I wanted the coffee from the cart across the street when the man from the fourth row appeared beside me. He did not introduce himself immediately. He stood next to me and looked out at the parking lot and said, in a voice calibrated not to carry, "She told me about you, said you were the stubborn one." I looked at him. He was in his mid-40s, lean, with the particular way of holding himself that comes from years of physical discipline and does not entirely leave when the discipline does. He was wearing a plain gray jacket and dark pants, nothing that identified him as anything, but there was a watchfulness about him that I recognized without being able to name. "Who are you?" I said. He said his name was Thomas Vick. He said he had been a master sergeant, attached to a maintenance unit at Naval Air Station Oceana, and that he had known Grace Caldwell in the 2 years before her last flight. He said it the way people say things they have been rehearsing, carefully, with the awareness that the words have to carry a specific weight without tipping over into something he was not ready to say yet. "What kind of maintenance unit?" I asked. He looked at me then. His eyes were the particular kind of tire that is not about sleep, the kind that accumulates from carrying something too long, the kind that checks aircraft before they fly, he said. The kind that signs off on system integrity before a pilot gets in the cockpit. The parking lot was ordinary and bright and full of lunch-hour cars. A bus went by on the street. Somewhere behind us, a door opened and let out a brief wash of institutional air conditioning. "She knew," Vic said. He was not looking at me anymore. He was looking at a point in the middle distance with the focused quality of a man who has made a decision and is watching it leave his hands. "She came to me 2 weeks before it happened. Said she had been flagging anomalies in her aircraft's avionics system for 3 weeks, and the paperwork kept getting lost. She asked me to document it independently. I did. And then I had to watch what happened, and know that the independent documentation was sitting in a folder in my locker because I was afraid. And I have been afraid for 3 years, and I am done being afraid. I stood very still. The coffee cart was still across the street. The ordinary world was still in progress all around us, indifferent and bright and continuous. "Who signed the maintenance logs?" I said. My voice came out flat and clean, the way it always did when the situation became serious enough that emotion was a luxury I could not afford. Thomas Vick looked at me and said a name. It was my brother's name. I want to tell you that I had suspected it. I want to be able to say that some part of me had been moving toward this knowledge for 3 years, quietly assembling the evidence, carrying the suspicion like a concealed instrument. That would be a neater story. The truth is that I had not suspected it. The truth is that I stood on those courthouse steps in the October afternoon and felt the ground reorganize itself under my feet in the way that it sometimes does when a fact arrives that is too large and too permanent to absorb quickly. And for a moment I could not locate anything solid. My brother Daniel had worked aircraft maintenance at Naval Air Station Oceana for 4 years before he left the Navy. He had been stationed there at the same time. Grace was flying out of the same base. He had signed off on maintenance logs. These were facts I had always known, filed in the ordinary category of family overlap, the small coincidences and adjacencies that accumulate in military families where everyone inhabits the same small world for years. I had not connected them to the morning Grace's aircraft lost avionics 30 seconds after takeoff and went into the water. I pressed my hand flat against the stone railing of the courthouse steps until I could feel the roughness of it against my palm. Then I took a breath, and then another one, and then I went back inside, because Marcus was in that building, and I still had an afternoon session to survive. Priya's cross-examination of Merritt was careful and systematic, the way she did everything, and she made progress. Visible, measurable progress, the kind that changes the temperature of a room. She established that Merritt had never met me, never spoken to me, never conducted any portion of a clinical evaluation of me in person. She established that the evaluation had been prepared based entirely on documentation. She asked him to describe the chain of custody of that documentation, and watched him become slightly vaguer than he had been on direct examination. She did not yet have the thing she needed to finish it. We both knew that. The evaluation was wrong, demonstrably wrong, constructed from another patient's records with my name transposed, but Priya needed the original records to prove the transposition, and the original records were locked behind medical privacy laws that took time and a court order to unlock properly, and time was what we were running out of. When Merritt stepped down, Judge Weston looked at the clock on the courtroom wall and said he would have a preliminary ruling on temporary guardianship arrangement at the end of the week. He said it in a tone that suggested the ruling was already largely formed, which it probably was. I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon with Priya at my shoulder, and she said very quietly, "We need something that changes the math before Friday." "I know," I said. "I'm working on it." I called James Okafor at 11 o'clock that night. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he had either been awake or had been sleeping lightly enough that he was awake the moment his phone went off. Both were consistent with what I knew about him. We had served together for 3 years, overlapping tours that put us in the same briefing rooms, often enough that we knew each other's professional habits and professional limits in the specific way that military service reveals people. He was a lieutenant colonel with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, which meant he spent his professional life in the space between what was provably true and what was conveniently documented, and he was very good at his work in the particular way of people who genuinely believe it matters. We had not stayed in close contact after our overlapping service ended. This was partly logistics, and partly the consequence of a conversation we had had 5 years ago in the parking lot of an officers' club in Virginia. A conversation in which he had said certain things, and I had responded in a way that I had told myself was practical and had known, even at the time, was something more like fear. I was afraid of what it would mean to let someone in that close, someone who would be present for the parts of me that were not composed and measured and in command of the room. I was afraid of needing someone and then losing them. It is not a noble fear, and it is not an uncommon one, and I had been living with the consequences of it for 5 years. "Renee?" he said, and there was no surprise in his voice, just the flat, careful quality of a man preparing to be told something that requires his full attention. I told him everything. I told him about the lawsuit and the fraudulent evaluation and Marcus and the envelope and Thomas Vick and what Vick had told me on the courthouse steps. I talked for 17 minutes without stopping, which was longer than I usually talked about anything. And when I was done, there was a silence that lasted long enough for me to become aware of the clock in my hallway again. The accident investigation was closed, James said finally. I know because my office flagged it 18 months ago for secondary review and it got shut down by someone 2 levels above me before we got past the initial file pull. I kept the flag. I kept the documentation. I could not push it open again alone. He paused. I can push it open now, he said. I need the file on Merritt's real patient, I said. I need to be able to prove in court, by Friday morning, that the evaluation is a fraudulent substitution. That's a medical record request through proper channels, he said. It takes time. I know. Another silence. Is Marcus okay? He asked. The question landed differently than I expected. Not the case. Not the strategy. Not the legal problem. The boy. I sat with that for a moment. He's asleep, I said. He asked me tonight if he was going to have to move. I told him no. Then we'd better make sure that's true, James said. James Okafor arrived at my house at 6 the next morning, with 2 cups of coffee from the all-night diner 3 miles away and a tablet loaded with what he had already spent the night compiling. He did not apologize for the early hour and I did not ask him to. We sat at my kitchen table and spread the documentation across its surface and worked in the way that people work when the work is real and the deadline is real and there is no room for anything except the problem in front of them. Thomas Vick's documentation was legitimate. The anomaly reports Grace had asked him to record independently existed and were dated and time-stamped with the specificity of a man who had known, even then, that he might need them to be unimpeachable. They showed a pattern of avionics irregularities on Grace's assigned aircraft over a 6-week period, irregularities that had been reported through official channels and that the official maintenance logs showed as resolved on dates that did not match the pattern of Vick's independent record. The official maintenance logs, signed by a rotating crew of technicians, with final approval on the last date, signed by Daniel Caldwell. This was not yet proof of intent. I understood that. The gap between negligence and deliberate action is a legal distance that requires more than what we had, and James said so plainly, because he was not the kind of person who told you what you wanted to hear when the truth was more complicated. But it was enough to reopen the investigation. It was enough to matter. For the case itself, for Marcus, we needed the Merritt substitution. James made calls starting at 7 in the morning. He had contacts in the medical credentialing system that most people outside his office did not have, and he used them with the economical precision of someone spending a finite resource carefully. By 9 o'clock we had a name, a female technical sergeant who had been treated by Merritt 18 months earlier for documented PTSD following deployment, a woman whose case file bore enough surface similarities to mine, in terms of demographics and service history, that someone looking to build a fraudulent evaluation on a real foundation had found her useful. By 10 o'clock we had a signed affidavit from that woman, confirming that her records had been accessed without her authorization and that she had not consented to their use in any legal proceeding. By 10:30 I was back at the courthouse, 40 minutes before the afternoon session was scheduled to begin, sitting in my car in the parking garage doing the thing I always did, which was think about Grace. I thought about her buying that bear at the gift shop on a Tuesday afternoon, explaining to a 4-year-old Marcus why the bear needed a military rank. I thought about her handing me that envelope in the Waffle House parking lot, the matter-of-fact way she had tucked it into my jacket pocket, as if she were handing me something ordinary. I thought about what it meant that she had prepared for the possibility of what was happening now while she was still alive, that she had taken the time to arrange things so that if something happened, her son would be protected and her sister would have what she needed. She had known me. She had known I would not open the envelope until I truly needed it, and she had trusted me to know when that was. She had also known that I would need more than sentiment to fight what was coming, so she had given me something concrete. I took the envelope from my bag, the original, which I had kept intact for the 3 years since she had given it to me, and had finally opened at 2 in the morning 2 days ago. I held it for a moment, the way you hold things that have weight beyond their physical mass. Then I went inside. The afternoon session was quieter. Ferris presented supplementary character witnesses, 2 people who testified about Daniel's recent efforts at personal growth and stability, with the slightly rehearsed sincerity of people who had been briefed on what to emphasize. I watched Yvette while they spoke. She was attentive and composed, and I could not find anything in her face that looked like doubt, which told me she still believed this was already settled. That belief, I was about to change. When the witness examinations were complete, Priya stood and said she had additional evidence to present. Ferris objected on timeliness grounds, which was his right, and Weston sustained the objection, and I had been prepared for this, which was why I was already standing. Your Honor, I said, and Priya sat down because she knew, from 11 days of working together, that there were moments that belonged to her, and moments that belonged to me. I would like to address the court directly, if the court will permit it. Weston looked at me with a particular measuring quality that had not left his face in 2 days. The expression of a man deciding whether to allow something he cannot yet see the dimensions of. He said I could proceed. I set the envelope on the table in front of me. Not the folder, not the affidavit, not the investigative documentation. The envelope first. Because what was inside it was the foundation of everything else. And I wanted the foundation to be visible before the structure went up. This envelope, I said, was given to me by Grace Caldwell, my sister and Marcus's mother, 6 months before her death. She asked me to open it when I needed it. I opened it 2 days ago. I paused for one beat. Inside is a notarized addendum to her will, signed and witnessed, which specifies that the trust established for Marcus Caldwell becomes legally untouchable in the event of any contested guardianship proceeding. The funds are frozen until Marcus reaches the age of 21. They cannot be accessed, administered, or benefited from by any appointed guardian during the contestation period. The room went very quiet. I did not look at Yvette. I did not need to. My sister, I said, and my voice stayed level, stayed flat, stayed where I needed it, though somewhere underneath it something had shifted and opened, and was doing its best to stay contained. Understood what might happen to her son if someone decided his welfare was a financial transaction. She arranged accordingly. There is no money to be gained by obtaining guardianship of Marcus Caldwell. There is only the actual work of raising him. I set the second document on the table. This is a notarized affidavit from the actual patient whose medical records were used to construct the fraudulent psychological evaluation submitted by opposing counsel. Her name is withheld for her privacy, but the affidavit confirms that her records were accessed without authorization and her case history was used without her knowledge or consent. I set the third document beside it. This is the documentation supporting a reopened investigation into the aircraft accident that killed Grace Caldwell, initiated this morning by the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, based on newly surfaced maintenance records, showing inconsistencies in the pre-flight logs for Grace Caldwell's aircraft on the day she died. I looked up from the documents. And this, I said, setting the fourth document on the table, is a formal complaint filed with the Office of the Inspector General of the Department of Defense, dated 72 hours before this proceeding began, which I filed because I knew, regardless of what happened in this courtroom, that what had been done to Grace Caldwell deserved an accounting that was larger than a custody dispute. The fourth document landed and stayed. Ferris was already on his feet, his prepared smoothness working against him now, the control starting to show through the polish. He was objecting and citing procedures and talking about proper submission channels, and he was right about some of it in the technical sense, the way people are right about procedural things, while the substantive thing is already past them and in motion. Weston held up his hand and the room went quiet. He looked at the documents on my table for a long moment. He looked at Ferris. He looked at Daniel, who had stopped being still and was now leaning toward his attorney with the urgent, compressed posture of someone who has just realized the room they are in has changed shape. Then Weston looked at me. He had the expression of a man who has been managing a room for 2 days, based on an understanding of what the room contained, and who has just been informed that his understanding was incomplete. He was recalibrating in real time, and I could see it happening. The slight adjustment in the set of his jaw, the way his eyes moved to the court reporter and then back to the documentation, taking the measure of how much of this was now permanent record. "We will take a recess," he said. His voice was even and controlled and emptied of the particular quality of settled certainty it had carried since Monday morning. He stood. The bailiff moved. The room began to breathe again. James Okafor, who had been sitting in the fourth row all afternoon, 2 seats from where Thomas Vick had sat that morning, stood up and walked calmly to the side door. He had 2 Air Force investigators with him, which I had not known about until that moment, and which told me that his morning had been more productive than even he had indicated. Priya leaned toward me and said, very quietly, "That was masterful." "It's not over," I said. "Not until Marcus is home." The recess lasted 40 minutes. When Weston returned, his rulings came in a specific order that I had not anticipated, but that made a certain procedural sense. He suspended the temporary guardianship recommendation pending review of the newly submitted evidence. He ordered Ferris to show cause within 48 hours why the psychological evaluation should not be struck from the record. He referred the documentation regarding the maintenance logs to the appropriate federal investigating authority, which was already in motion, but the referral made it official, and on the record, and no longer a thing that could be quietly managed. He did not apologize. I had not expected one. Men who have spent their professional lives in positions of judgment do not find apology natural, and Weston was not a bad man. Exactly, only a man who had made assumptions based on incomplete information, and paid insufficient attention to what was underneath them. Daniel left the courthouse without speaking to me. I watched him go through the glass doors with Yvette at his shoulder, and Ferris behind them, the three of them close together in the way of people who have just agreed to contain something that is threatening to get loose. Yvette was talking and Daniel was not responding, and Ferris was looking at his phone, and the conversation they were having was not the conversation they had planned to have walking out of this building. I waited until they were gone. Then I sat down on a bench in the corridor and let myself be still for a moment, which was all I permitted myself, because Marcus was upstairs with his grandmother, and I had told him I would come and tell him what happened. I had made him a promise. The 48 hours that followed were not simple. I want to be honest about that too, because stories about justice have a way of compressing the parts where justice is slow and uncomfortable and requires you to sit in uncertainty while the mechanisms work through their processes at their own pace. Ferris filed a response challenging the affidavit's admissibility on technical grounds. The challenge was not frivolous. Medical records privacy law is complicated, and even an unauthorized use of a patient's records creates procedural complications for the person trying to use that fact as evidence. Priya spent most of the next day on the phone with a specialist in medical law, and I spent most of it at home with Marcus, where we made dinner together, which consisted of Marcus insisting on adding an unreasonable amount of cheese to everything, and me allowing it because some battles are not worth fighting, and some evenings are not about winning. He asked me, while we were washing dishes, if Captain the Bear would be allowed to come with him if he had to go somewhere new. I said yes. Captain could always come. He said okay, and dried a plate with the focused seriousness he brought to all practical matters. And I stood at the sink and looked out the window at the backyard, and held onto the counter with both hands for a moment, until I was sure my face was not going to do something I did not want it to do. James came over that evening. He had news about the investigation, which was moving faster than most investigations move, because the documentation Thomas Vick had kept was more complete than even James had expected, the kind of careful, thorough record that a man keeps when he has been waiting for 3 years for a moment, when he could finally bring it out into the light without it getting buried again. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had read Grace's letter at 2 a.m, and he spread out what they had found and walked me through it in his careful, methodical way. When he was done, we sat in the quiet of the kitchen for a moment, the kind of quiet that follows when something that has been held at a remove finally becomes real. She knew it wasn't an accident, I said. She suspected, James said. He was careful about the distinction, which was one of the things I had always appreciated about him. She didn't have proof. She had enough to be afraid. And she didn't tell me because I would have done something about it before she was ready. I said it without bitterness, because it was true, and because Grace had known me well enough to know it was true, and protecting me from my own instincts had been one of the small, persistent gifts she had given me throughout our lives. James looked at me across the table. He had a way of being quiet that did not feel like absence, a way of being present without requiring anything of the moment. She gave you what you needed instead, he said. I looked at the table. I looked at the papers spread across it. I thought about a parking lot off Interstate 64 and a folded envelope, and a woman who knew that some things needed to be prepared for before they arrived. She gave me more than I needed, I said. On the third morning, Weston struck the psychological evaluation from the record. He did it in a 2-paragraph ruling that was concise and procedurally correct, and acknowledged, without dwelling on it, that the documentation had been improperly obtained and improperly submitted. Ferris did not appeal the ruling immediately, which told me that the conversation with Daniel in the parking lot on the day of the recess had produced a recalibration of strategy. The recalibration did not save them. 2 days later, Daniel called me. Not Ferris, not through any intermediary, but Daniel himself, from his cell phone, at 8:30 in the morning on a Thursday, which was the time he had always called when he needed something and was working up to asking for it. I recognized the number, and I stood in my kitchen and decided to answer. He asked me if we could meet. He said he wanted to talk without lawyers. I said yes. We met at a coffee shop on the other side of town, the kind of neutral territory that says neither person has an advantage, a place with enough background noise that a conversation could stay private without having to be whispered. He was there when I arrived, already halfway through a cup of coffee, and he looked like a man who had not been sleeping, which I recognized as consequential because Daniel had always been a good sleeper, even in the worst circumstances of his life. "You knew about the records," he said. "Not a question. I knew enough," I said. He put both hands around his cup, the way people do when they want something to hold on to. "Yvette found out about the trust 6 months after Grace died," he said. "The attorney contacted us. It was more than either of us had understood. And she started talking about what it would take, what the process would be, and I told her no." He paused. He looked at the cup. "And then she kept talking, and I told her no again. And she kept talking. I know how she talks," I said. He looked up at that, and for a moment he was my brother in the simplest sense, the boy who had grown up in the same house as me, who had known me before I was anyone in particular, and the look on his face was something I had not seen from him in years, something that had been a casualty of Yvette's particular way of reshaping the people around her. He looked ashamed. "I didn't know about Grace's plane," he said. "I need you to know that." I sat with this. It was the thing I had been trying to determine since the courthouse steps, since Thomas Vick had said Daniel's name in the parking lot. The maintenance logs had Daniel's signature, but a signature on a log is not intent, is not knowledge, is not the same as the kind of deliberate action that ends a life. James's investigation would determine what the signatures meant. That was the work of investigators and prosecutors and processes larger than this coffee shop. What I needed to know, right now, sitting across from the person who had been my brother before Yvette taught him to see our family as a resource to be managed, was whether this particular thing was true. I looked at him for a long time. "Okay," I said. He let out a breath. It was a long breath, longer than it should have been, which told me he had been carrying that sentence like a stone. "The lawsuit," he said. "It's over," I said. "You know it's over." "I know." We sat for a moment in the noise of the coffee shop, ordinary Thursday morning noise, the world going on around us with its usual indifference to the specific weight of specific moments. "I signed off on maintenance logs I didn't always personally verify," he said. "I know what that means. I know the investigation is going to look at it." "It is," I said. He nodded. He looked down at the coffee. "Whatever happens," he said, "whatever they find, Marcus should stay with you. That's where he should be." He said it the way people say things they have decided on at some real cost. Not easily, not without consequence, but with the particular clarity of a person who has finally identified, beneath all the noise and the management and the arrangements, what actually matters. I drove home, and I sat in my car in the driveway for a few minutes. I thought about Grace. I thought about what she would have said about this morning, about the coffee shop, about Daniel's face. She would have said something precise and slightly unkind, and then she would have laughed too loud, and then she would have said, "But he's still our brother." She was right. He was still our brother. The investigation would find what it found, and Daniel would face what he had to face, and I would not be able to hold both of those things and be angry at the same time. I was tired of being angry. Anger had been useful, all the way through. It had kept me sharp and focused and moving, but sitting in my driveway on a Thursday morning, I could feel it beginning to lift, the way morning fog lifts, when the sun has finally come far enough up to matter. I went inside. Marcus was eating cereal and reading a library book propped against the milk carton, the book about deep-sea creatures that he had checked out 3 weeks ago and renewed twice. He did not look up when I came in. "The vampire squid," he said, "to the book and incidentally to me, can turn itself inside out." "Good survival strategy," I said. He considered this seriously, the way he considered most things. "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." James came to the house that evening with takeout from the Thai place that Marcus had decided was acceptable, as long as they got the pad see ew with extra noodles. We ate at the kitchen table, the three of us, and Marcus explained to James about the vampire squid at considerable length, and James listened with the full, genuine attention that I had always noticed about him, the quality of a person who does not pretend to be interested when they are not, which meant when he was interested, you knew it was real. After Marcus was in bed, James and I sat on the back porch. The neighborhood was quiet in the specific way of residential streets on weekday evenings, distant cars, and someone's dog, and the comfortable absence of urgency. I had 2 cups of coffee I had made with the intention of drinking, but had so far only held. Yvette filed a separate motion this afternoon, James said. Her attorney is trying to negotiate terms. I know, Priya had called me. She's distancing herself from the merit evaluation, claiming she didn't know the records were improperly obtained. She knew, I said. She knew, James agreed. But she didn't sign anything. She's going to make that very difficult to prove. I thought about Yvette in the courtroom in her pale blue dress, with her new nails and her settled expression, and I thought about the specific kind of intelligence it takes to remain technically deniable while engineering something that requires considerable engineering. She was not stupid. She had never been stupid. She had simply been pointed in a direction that used all her sharpest qualities for purposes that served nobody well. She'll get less than she deserves, I said. Probably, James said. That's usually how it works. I looked at the backyard, dark and ordinary and mine, the fence that needed painting and the garden I kept meaning to do something about, and the old oak tree in the corner that had been there before. I bought the house and would be there after. Grace had stood in this backyard at the housewarming party, with Marcus on her hip because he was 4 and could not be trusted not to go directly toward the garden hose and turn it on himself, and she had said something about the oak tree, something about how trees that old were good luck because they had survived everything that had been thrown at them and were still here. I owe you, I said. You don't, James said. I owed Grace. I looked at him. He was looking at the backyard, the same dark, ordinary backyard, and his profile in the porch light had the particular quality of a person thinking about something at a safe remove, keeping it at the distance required to talk about it without it getting too close. You knew her, I said. We served at the same base for 8 months, he said. She was one of those people that you can't quite account for. You meet most people and you understand pretty quickly how they work. With Grace, you were always just slightly behind. He paused. She talked about you constantly. That sounds like her, I said. She said you were the stubborn one, he said. She said it like it was your best quality. The porch was quiet. The neighborhood was quiet. Somewhere up in the oak tree, something moved. A bird settling, leaves adjusting. I called you at 11 o'clock at night, I said. I know. I could have called Priya. I could have called any number of people who could have helped with the investigation. I know, he said again. His voice was even and without pressure, the voice of a person who is not trying to make something happen but is willing to let it. I called you, I said, because I needed someone to be there with me. Not to fix it, just to be there. He turned and looked at me then. In the porch light, his eyes had the quality of quiet water, still and present and not going anywhere. I know, he said, for the 3rd time. And this time it meant something different from the other 2. I looked at him for a long moment. 5 years is a long time to be practical about something. 5 years is a long time to mistake fear for wisdom. I was wrong, I said. 5 years ago. I was afraid, and I told myself it was practical, and I was wrong. I know that too, he said. He reached across the space between our chairs and put his hand over mine, palm down, steady and warm and undemanding. The gesture of a man who had learned a long time ago that some things are worth waiting for. I did not pull away. The formal withdrawal of the custody petition came 12 days later, filed by Ferris on behalf of Daniel, citing changed circumstances in the best interests of the minor child. The investigating authorities' preliminary findings, not yet public but communicated to the relevant parties through proper channels, had made the changed circumstances unavoidable. Yvette's motion for separate proceedings went through a complicated several months that I will not reconstruct in full because it belongs to the legal record more than it belongs to this story. What I will say is that she received consequences that were real, and she received them without Daniel, which was not a punishment I had sought, but which struck me, watching it unfold, as appropriate. The life she had spent years constructing around his family name and his family's gravity collapsed inward when the center of it stopped holding, and she had to begin the work of building something from the pieces that were actually hers. I do not know if she found anything better in them. I genuinely hope she did. Daniel's situation was more complicated, as it deserved to be. The investigation took time, and during that time he was cooperative in a way that his attorney told mine was complete and without reservation, which I chose to believe because I had looked at his face in the coffee shop and I was a good judge of faces. He had not known about Grace's plane in the way that matters in a courtroom. What he had known about, and what he had to account for, were the corners he had cut and the checks he had not performed, and the signatures he had placed on documents that he had not fully verified over a period of years, not out of malice, but out of the particular carelessness of a person who has decided that close enough is usually fine. Close enough had not been fine. It had cost his son a mother, and whether or not that was criminal negligence in the legal sense, Daniel knew what it was in every other sense, and he would be accounting for that knowledge for the rest of his life. Thomas Vick testified when he was asked to testify, fully and without equivocation, and the careful documentation he had kept for 3 years was entered into the record and treated with the weight it deserved. He called me once, after it was done, and said he was sorry it had taken so long, and I said he did it when he could, and that was enough. On a Saturday in November, James brought donuts, and Marcus discovered that a glazed old-fashioned was the best donut that existed in the known universe and would not be argued with about this, which struck me as entirely consistent with his character. We ate donuts and watched college football, which Marcus had recently decided he liked because of the marching bands, and the morning was ordinary and complete, in the way that ordinary mornings are when they are what you have been trying to get back to for a long time. At some point, Marcus fell asleep on the couch with Cap the bear tucked under one arm, which he would have protested fiercely if he had been awake for it, and James and I sat in the quiet and let the football game go on without us. Grace used to say she wanted him to have someone like you, James said. Like me, I said. Stubborn, he said. She said the world needed more people who were absolutely certain of the right thing and absolutely unwilling to do the wrong one. I looked at Marcus asleep on the couch. His sneakers were still on, which I would not have allowed if I were paying attention, and Cap was tucked under his arm at the slightly awkward angle of someone who had grabbed him quickly before sleep arrived, and his face in sleep had the uncomplicated openness that children's faces have when they feel safe enough to relax completely. I thought about Grace buying a bear at a gift shop on a Tuesday afternoon, trying to explain military rank to a 4-year-old. I thought about a folded envelope in a jacket pocket, and the sentence, "You'll know when." I thought about a parking lot off Interstate 64, and a conversation we never finished, and all the things left unsaid between people who assume they will have more time. She had not been wrong. I did know when. "I'm going to fight every single time it matters," I said. "That's just who I am." "I know," James said. He said it the way he always said it, quiet and steady, and carrying exactly the weight it was meant to carry. Outside, the oak tree was bare now, the leaves long down, and the late November light came through the window, the color of old brass. And in the yard, the fence still needed painting, and the garden was still waiting for spring. And in the living room, a 7-year-old boy was asleep with his bear and his sneakers on, and the morning was ordinary and complete, and entirely mine. That was enough. It had always been going to be enough. I just had to get here first. Later that afternoon, when Marcus woke up and discovered his sneakers were still on and declared this a personal record, and James made another pot of coffee because neither of us was ready for the morning to be over, I went out to the backyard for a few minutes alone. The oak tree stood at the back corner of the yard exactly as it always had, bare-branched and patient against the pale November sky, the kind of tree that has absorbed 17 winters and finds the 18th unremarkable. I stood under it and looked up through the branches at the light, the way Grace used to look up at the sky before a flight, not checking the weather, just looking, just marking the particular quality of the day. I had a conversation with her once, the way you have conversations with people after they are gone, standing under an oak tree in November on an ordinary Saturday, neither asking nor expecting anything back, just speaking because the speaking itself was the thing. I told her that Marcus had discovered glazed old-fashions. I told her he still slept with Cap. I told her that I had finally opened the envelope, and that she had been right about everything, the way she was always right about everything, and that I was sorry it had taken me so long to learn how to need people, and that I was working on it. The November light moved through the bare branches. The yard was quiet. I went back inside.